two things I want to talk about, mainly two of the ideas that our opponents have brought to the table today. This idea that journalism is evolving to adapt with the challenges presented by social media and doing so successfully. Secondly, on this idea of truth that Rachel spent a lot of time talking about just now. So moving swiftly on to this first idea of evolution, because I've got a lot of ground to cover. Now, Mr. Edwards came up and talked about, at the very end of this speech, he gave a disclaimer. He said that provided that journalism evolves, and social media can become a very, very important tool and useful tool of professional journalism today. We're here to tell you that journalism is not necessarily evolving and adapting and rolling with the development of social media. In fact, the lines between professional journalism and the massive amateurism out there is slowly blurring, and we don't really know, ladies and gentlemen, what professional journalism does actually remain today. As we say on this side of the house, right, if journalism is embracing social media to the extent that the line between journalism versus amateur sources and information and dissemination of all these sorts of things is being blurred, we don't see how they can simply hide behind this idea of the fact that it is taking in and incorporating social media as a part of its natural self. We told you right from the start, and we have to remember this, that this motion is about social media being the single greatest challenge. And we think that journalism is being forced to adapt and to change its fundamental structure of having the monopoly over the public truth as the thing that we have to focus on today. And we've given you a lot of ideas, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, this idea that journalism is starting to be rivaled in terms of content creation and usage. We gave you the idea of direct communication between groups such as Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda with people, this idea of direct communication with celebrities, the use of the Twitter feed, even simply people on the street having smartphones and tweeting about certain things means that the idea of a bridge and content creation is being eroded right from the start. We think that their team simply choosing to focus a lot of their arguments in terms of us mistaking the medium for the message is actually false. If you listen to some of the things that we were talking about earlier, we did actually talk a lot about the actual message that is presented to the public, which is the most important thing here. If both sides are talking about journalism and the actual message and the public truth that is being created for the purposes of public information, this is the kind of thing that we have to focus on, that the bridge is being eroded. But secondly, we say that we had a concession from their side of the house, right? They're talking about the fact that journalists themselves are starting to use social media as some of their sources. We say that this fundamental nature, a change in the nature of the collection of information, also represents a change that the professional journalist industry has had to accept without being able to adapt to the challenge in any other way other than embracing social media, right? So this obviously already presents a kind of challenge and something that they've had to adapt to, not necessarily successfully, apart from embracing social media as a whole. But secondly, we already had another concession in terms of the fact that social media's effectiveness has been unchallenged on their side of the house in terms of dissemination. We talked about the idea that CNN might get 110 million. We told you Twitter has 1.6 billion per day, ladies and gentlemen, something that they haven't necessarily gone back on us to. But thirdly, we say that even if journalism is evolving to take into account these new challenges, right? We say, then why are journalism and why are news companies actually evolving to become more like social media in the first place? We have websites developing things like comment feeds, incorporating Facebook and Twitter and things like that, in response to consumer demand, in terms of immediacy and also the credibility of the crowd, ladies and gentlemen. And we say that if journalism is evolving to embrace it wholeheartedly, we say that the lines between journalism and between social media are being eroded, and they can't necessarily say that it's being incorporated into journalism. Instead, journalism itself is becoming much more like social media because they can't get around the fact that social media is the new big thing of today's generation, ladies and gentlemen. But before I move on to talk about truth, I have a final thing to say about evolution. Because one of the things that they've been talking about is the idea that journalism's been here before. We dispute this. We've had telegraphs, we've had pigeons, we've even had smoke signals in the past, ladies and gentlemen. But we say to you on this side of the house that in no other period in human history, whether technological change or through wars or anything like that, has the core nature of journalism as having a monopoly over the creation and dissemination of the public truth being so fundamentally rocked as in this day and age. We have the empowerment of everyday people to become their own journalists, to be able to talk to the world. And in this day and age, ladies and gentlemen, the relevance of professional journalism is undoubtedly reducing in comparison to the past. And we say that's why it still remains the greatest challenge. But on to the second idea about truth that Rachel spent a long time talking about. And I want to introduce our perspective on this through analyzing this idea of the children dying in Syria. So she challenged that a picture can't necessarily tell us who, what, when, where, or why. Well, firstly, we say that there is actually a reducing reliance on truth. And the new and younger generation far prefer immediacy and a corroboration of different sources on the internet, and the over-reliance on some things like a news feed or a Twitter feed to actually get this information. They're not necessarily so interested in the accuracy of the truth. As long as they know something bad's happening in Syria, that people are dying, that's often far more than enough than actually clicking onto the BBC or CNN article and looking further forward.
Point of information?
Yes, ma'am.
I view myself as part of the younger generation, and I would very much object to the idea that I wouldn't be interested in verifying the facts as I read them.
Thank you, Rachel. But unfortunately, I believe that we're an extremely privileged and very knowledgeable crowd in today's day and age. And in fact, we contend that the vast majority of people, young people especially on social media, don't necessarily have the interest or motivation to click one step further, as long as they know something's happening in Syria, something's happening in Afghanistan, something has to be done about it, not necessarily what. No, thank you, ma'am. But even if accuracy is being blurred, we say that this very fact, that readers are choosing to follow different things, that readers are not necessarily following up on accuracy or anything like that, means that journalism in its professional sense needs to spend time trying to verify things, trying to cut through the noise, trying to challenge all the noise, as they were saying, out there, ladies and gentlemen. This represents man hours, this represents a distraction, and again, a challenge to the monopoly over the creation and dissemination of truth. Thank you so much. And we say that this idea, and the idea that Mr. Edwards brought up in his speech, this idea about the lack of trust, right? We say that social media in its entirety is actually facilitating lack of trust, actually perpetuating a lack of trust in the professional journalism industry, by allowing, for the first time in history, a platform for hardliners, for conspiracists, for people who don't necessarily trust media to get together and rely on other sources. The fact that in the past, ladies and gentlemen, we got our news from newspapers, we got our news from the TV, that's over. And the fact that people now have the opportunity to get together and hide behind their self-delusions, to hide behind whatever they want to believe, and to also spread it to the rest of the world, also represents a challenge that journalism hasn't been able to deal with and will not be able to get rid of simply because of the rise of technological changes like the internet. Ladies and gentlemen, I have presented a very bleak picture of journalism today, and we are very respectful of the fact that all of you are here and doing such a wonderful job. We indeed hope you can roll with the times, but at this moment, regardless of what happens to professional journalism, social media represents a challenge, and that's what we need to prove on this side of the house.
Mr. Kevin